All right, welcome back for another deep dive. You guys have really outdone yourselves this time, sending in excerpts from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment.
Yeah, a classic.
A real page-turner. Murder, intrigue, philosophy, you name it.
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't love a good psychological thriller, right? Cher. So, are you ready to get inside the mind of a murderer?
I think that's what makes Crime and Punishment so fascinating, isn't it? It's not just about the crime itself. Dostoevsky really takes us deep into the psychology of the criminal Rodion Raskolnikov, making us confront those dark, uncomfortable parts of ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think that's what we're going to be focusing on in this deep dive. It's not a whodunit, right? We know who did it. The question is why? And these excerpts, they don't hold back. We see Raskolnikov before the murders, his poverty, his isolation, those dangerous ideas he's wrestling with. It's like a powder keg waiting to explode.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that context, right? I mean, Dostoevsky sets the stage so meticulously, you can practically feel the grime and despair of St. Petersburg. Even Raskolnikov's room, that cramped yellow room, it's not just a setting, it's a reflection of his mental state. Isolated, suffocating.
Yeah, and even the way he avoids his landlady, it's like he's already withdrawing from the world, from human connection, before the crime even takes place.
Exactly. He's retreating into his own head, and it's a head filled with all these nihilistic ideas, this intellectual arrogance. And this brings us to, I think, one of the first major threads we see in these excerpts, which is how does poverty and isolation shape Raskolnikov's worldview? And it's no coincidence that he finds himself drawn to the misery of others.
Well, you're talking about that encounter with Marmeladov in the tavern right now. Talk about a character who just oozes despair. He pours his heart out to Raskolnikov about his family's poverty, his daughter Sonya having to turn to prostitution. It's just heartbreaking.
And while Marmeladov might seem like a pathetic drunk, I think Dostoevsky uses him to maybe subtly plant the seed of justification for crime in Raskolnikov's mind. Like, remember how Marmeladov kind of glorifies Sonya's sacrifice? He paints her as this martyr, almost suggesting that certain actions, no matter how immoral, can be justified by circumstance.
Oh, that is so interesting. Because on the one hand, you can see Raskolnikov is just disgusted by Marmeladov. But at the same time, there's this weird pull, like he recognizes something of himself in this desperate man.
Exactly. And that desperation is just amplified when Raskolnikov receives a letter from his mother. And it's news that, well, it just fuels his anger and resentment. His sister, Dunya, is getting married, but not for love. Oh, no, she's marrying this guy, Luzhin, purely for financial security. And for Raskolnikov, well, Luzhin represents everything he despises. He even calls him a sensible businessman. It's like this ultimate insult.
Yeah, and it's like all these external pressures, his poverty, his family struggles, they're closing in on him. And then Dostoevsky starts weaving in these dream sequences, right? They're so vivid, like windows into Raskolnikov's subconscious. That recurring image of his childhood bedroom, the icon of the Holy Mother of Kazan. What do you make of those?
I think they're essential to understanding Raskolnikov's inner turmoil. You know, on the surface, he's all about this intellectualized nihilism, rejecting traditional morality. But those dreams, those glimpses of his past, they suggest this yearning for innocence, for faith, even as he's trying to deny those very things.
Yeah, it's like he's building this wall around himself, brick by brick, with each justification, each philosophical argument. But those dreams, they're like cracks in that wall, letting the light in, you know?
Right, exactly. And then there's this pivotal moment, this seemingly random conversation Raskolnikov overhears in the tavern. Okay. These two guys are talking about, of all people, Alyona Ivanovna, the pawnbroker. And one of them actually argues that killing her would be a just act, ridding society of a parasite.
Now, this conversation, this can't be just a coincidence, right? It's like, it's speaking directly to Raskolnikov's warped sense of morality.
Oh, absolutely. Remember, Raskolnikov's been toying with this idea of the extraordinary man, someone who's above conventional morality, like a Napoleon figure. And this conversation just feeds right into that dangerous fantasy.
Oh, yeah, it gives him permission.
Yeah.
And it's chilling how he starts applying this logic to the pawnbroker, convincing himself that her murder would be a moral good. It's like some twisted form of utilitarianism.
Right. And I think maybe this is a good time to pause and define that term for our listeners, because utilitarianism is this idea that the best action is the one that maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people. But in Raskolnikov's mind, it becomes distorted. You know, he twists it to justify his own selfish desires.
So he's basically cherry-picking philosophical ideas to suit his own agenda. It's like the classic trap of intellectual arrogance, isn't it? You think you're above the rules because you can rationalize anything.
Exactly. And that's where I think we get to the real heart of what Dostoevsky's exploring here, the gap between theory and reality. You know, Raskolnikov may have meticulously planned these murders in his head, but the reality, as we'll see, is far more chaotic, far more brutal.
Okay, so before we actually dive into the crime itself and its consequences, I want to take a moment to just step back and ask you, what's standing out to you so far in this deep dive? What's really grabbing your attention about Raskolnikov's world? His descent into darkness.
You know, it's funny. I was just thinking, like, Dostoevsky, he just lays it all out, you know. You see the tension building, and you almost know something awful's going to happen. But you can't stop reading. It's like one of those, those car crash videos.
It's like a train wreck in slow motion. Yeah, you just can't look away.
Exactly. And then when it finally happens, the way Dostoevsky describes the murders, I mean, wow. So brutal, so real. He doesn't sugarcoat anything. No, he doesn't. It's graphic. But it's also fascinating how that brutality completely shatters Raskolnikov's carefully constructed intellectual facade. Remember, he thinks he's going to be this cold, detached, extraordinary man, but the reality is so different.
Oh, yeah, totally. He's a mess. Like, even during the preparations, he's so anxious, so on edge, and then when Elizaveta walks in, he just panics. It's all so impulsive, so far from the controlled act he imagined.
That's it. That contrast between Raskolnikov's idealized vision of himself and the messy, chaotic reality of his actions, that's so crucial. It's like Dostoevsky's deconstructing the myth of the Superman, showing how even the most carefully constructed philosophies just crumble when confronted with the raw, visceral experience of violence.
And the psychological fallout, it's immediate. He's not just a criminal now, he's like a terrified animal, haunted by what he's done. Hiding in that flat, his mind racing, almost losing his grip on reality. It makes you wonder, is that the real punishment? Not the prison or whatever, but that mental torment.
That's the question, isn't it? Is true punishment something external, like the threat of being caught? Or is it internal, this unbearable weight of guilt? And that brings us to another fascinating layer of the story, which is the introduction of Porfiry Petrovich, the investigator.
Oh, yeah, Porfiry.
Yeah.
He's not your typical detective, is he? It's like he's playing some kind of psychological game with Raskolnikov, pushing his buttons instead of just trying to gather evidence.
I think Porfiry is just incredibly perceptive. He sees right through Raskolnikov, recognizes his intelligence, his tormented soul, and instead of a straight-up interrogation, he engages in these mind games. He knows Raskolnikov's already punishing himself, and he's just sort of accelerating that process.
Yeah, he's like a cat playing with a mouse. And then just when you think things couldn't get any more complex, we get introduced to Svidrigailov.
Svidrigailov, yeah. He's a tough one to pin down, isn't he? Both charming and menacing at the same time. I almost see him as like a dark reflection of Raskolnikov.
Oh, I totally see that. It's like they're two sides of the same coin, both wrestling with their pasts, both drawn to darkness. But Svidrigailov seems to be, I don't know, almost comfortable with it in a way that Raskolnikov isn't.
You hit the nail on the head. While Raskolnikov is drowning in guilt and paranoia, Svidrigailov just carries on with this unsettling nonchalance. And what makes it even more intriguing is his connection to Dunya, Raskolnikov's sister.
Right. He's got this creepy obsession with her, even though she clearly despises him. And that obsession, it leads to one of the most dramatic moments in the story, the false accusation against Sonya.
Yeah, it's pretty low. Remember, Dunya's engaged to Luzhin, the sensible businessman that Raskolnikov can't stand. And Luzhin, he feels threatened by Raskolnikov and Sonya, so he hatches this plan to discredit them.
It's so manipulative. He plants money on Sonya and accuses her of stealing, hoping to humiliate her and turn Dunya against Raskolnikov.
It's a cowardly move, but it also has a surprising effect. It's like
Right.
It awakens Raskolnikov's conscience. He just explodes, defending Sonya, exposing Luzhin for the fraud he is. For a moment, his own guilt takes a back seat to this sense of outrage, this injustice being inflicted on someone he cares about.
It's like a turning point for him, isn't it? Like he's forced to confront the consequences of his actions, not just for himself, but for the people around him.
Exactly. And it's Sonya who really guides him towards this idea of redemption. Her faith, her compassion, even for her accuser, it's just remarkable. She begs him to confess, to seek forgiveness, and she reads him the story of Lazarus, which, of course, is a symbol of resurrection, of hope.
Oh, I love that scene. That tiny room, the flickering candlelight, all that unspoken emotion, it's so powerful.
It's a moment of truth for Raskolnikov. He can't keep living in this self-imposed hell of guilt and isolation. He has to confess. He has to accept responsibility for what he's done.
So he does. He goes to the police and admits to the murders. But even then, I feel like there's still a part of him that's clinging to this delusion of being extraordinary,
Yeah.
Like he expects special treatment or maybe even admiration for his crime.
Oh, absolutely. It's like he hasn't fully grasped the weight of his actions. He gets sentenced to hard labor in Siberia, a harsh punishment, but just. But initially, at least, he remains defiant, still clinging to his twisted philosophy.
But Siberia, it changes him. It breaks him down. The physical hardships, they're nothing compared to the internal torment he's experiencing. The isolation, the guilt, the realization that he's not some Superman, but just another flawed human being.
That's where the real transformation happens. And of course, Sonya is instrumental in this. She follows him to Siberia, sacrificing everything to be near him, offering him this unconditional love and support.
Her devotion is just incredible. I mean, she could have stayed in St. Petersburg, rebuilt her life. But she chooses to follow him into this harsh, unforgiving world. It's a testament to the power of love, of forgiveness.
It really is. But before we delve deeper into Sonya's role in Raskolnikov's potential redemption, I'm curious, what are your thoughts so far? What's resonating with you about this journey? From the intellectualized crime to the brutal reality of punishment, and then this glimmer of hope that Sonya represents.
It's interesting how Raskolnikov, who starts off so arrogant, thinking he's this extraordinary man, he's brought down to earth, literally, by the reality of Siberia.
It's a harsh reality check, isn't it? He goes from this tiny room trapped in his own head to this vast, open landscape surrounded by, criminals. People who've done terrible things.
Right. And he's one of them now. No more theories, no more justifications, just the cold, hard truth of his actions. It's like all that intellectual posturing just melts away. And there's this detail in the excerpts I found so powerful. Remember how the other convicts, they start to treat him with respect?
I do. It's subtle, but it speaks volumes. Like, they can sense a change in him. He's not that aloof intellectual anymore, lost in his own world. He's actually connecting with them, recognizing their shared humanity, even in that desolate place.
And of course, Sonya's presence is huge. Even when he pushes her away at first, she never gives up on him.
Mm-hmm.
Her love, her faith in his redemption, it's unwavering.
It's really remarkable, isn't it? She could have stayed in St. Petersburg, tried to rebuild her life, but she chooses to follow him, to share his suffering. It makes you believe in the power of love, the power of forgiveness.
Absolutely. And it's that scene where she reads him the story of Lazarus. That's when it seems like he finally breaks down. He weeps. It's like he recognizes his own need for resurrection, for a chance to start over.
Yeah, it's a powerful moment. Like, all that guilt and shame he's been carrying, it finally spills out. But I think it's important to remember that Dostoevsky doesn't give us a simple, happy ending, right? Raskolnikov's redemption, it's a process, a long and difficult journey.
Oh, absolutely. He's still got a long way to go. He's still in prison, still facing the consequences of his actions. But there's that glimmer of hope, that sense that he's finally on the right path.
And that's what makes Dostoevsky so brilliant. Crime and Punishment, it's not just a morality tale. It's a deep exploration of what it means to be human. Our capacity for both good and evil. The struggle for redemption.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It challenges you to confront those uncomfortable parts of yourself, to really examine your own moral compass.
It does, and ultimately I think it leaves you with this sense of hope, that even in the darkest of circumstances, change is possible.
Well, this deep dive has been quite a journey. We've seen Raskolnikov's descent into darkness, his psychological torment, and then that glimmer of hope, that possibility of redemption. Crime and Punishment, it really is a masterpiece. A story that stays with you long after you finish it.
It does. It's a story that makes you question, makes you think. A story that reminds us that we're all capable of great things and terrible things, and that ultimately the choice is ours.
And for anyone listening who hasn't experienced this incredible book, I can't recommend it enough. It's definitely a challenging read, but so worth it. So many layers to unpack, so much to think about. You might even want to host your own deep dive after you finish it. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of Crime and Punishment.